Hi, welcome to Frame for Light. I'm Dave Kelly. This program is designed to help the viewer develop a greater appreciation for both the art and the science of photography. In today's episode, we're going to talk about filling the frame and utilizing various techniques and tips in framing that will allow you to create the best composition possible, no matter what the circumstance is that you might be encountering. But before we start on today's main topic, I'd like to do a brief recap of what we talked about in the previous episode, which was episode number 3. So in episode number 3, we talked about how light diffracts and lenses flare. And what we mean by this is that light is going to bounce between the lens elements in your camera, especially if you're pointing the camera toward the source of light, such as the sun. Now, if you're using a lens hood or a lens shade, you can keep out some of those aberrant rays from getting into your camera and bouncing around between those lens elements. But the good news is that lens flare can be used creatively to our advantage if we know how to use it in the right circumstances. We used an example in the previous episode of this Egyptian replica museum where there was lens flare at the top of the frame. And this was appropriate because the Egyptians were into mysticism, and this added a nice little mystical element to the frame, which I think is a creative enhancement. Now, we also talked last week about linear perspective and what that entails. Well, linear perspective means parallel lines that appear to converge or get closer together in the distance. Now, intellectually, we know that that's not true. If you look at railroad tracks, or you look at a road, or you look at railings on a bridge, you know that those lines, those parallel lines, are not getting closer together in the distance, but they certainly look that way. So they actually converge in our optical sense and create an interesting and compelling optical illusion. And we can use this to our advantage in photography. Here's an example of a pier where it looks like that pier is getting more and more narrow in the distance, and it looks like the railings are getting closer together. But we know that's not true, but it does make for an interesting effect. Here's another example with lights on light poles, and it appears that those lights are getting closer together at the bottom of the frame than they are at the top. But again, those lights are not getting any closer together. It's just an optical illusion, but it's a nice effect that we can utilize. We also talked in the previous episode about diagonal lines and how they help us to capture a sense of depth. They help us to depict or portray distance. They allow us to create a sense of drama if we use them properly. And they also, most importantly of all, they engage the eye so that when people look at diagonal lines, their eyes have to follow that line of the diagonal until it reaches its conclusion. So it really engages the viewer. And here's an example of what we used last week. This is a 2-lane highway which seems to stretch off into the distance forever. So we're creating a good sense of depth with this image. Here's another example. This shows 2 diagonal lines. First, there's a cannon on the left, which is pointing toward that wall from a diagonal perspective. And then we also see the wall itself and the curbing of that wall at the bottom, at the base. And you notice that that line starts on the lower right-hand side and stretches all the way across diagonally to the upper left. It actually makes the wall look shorter on the left-hand side of the frame than on the right. But we know that that wall is not shorter. That's, again, just linear perspective. So we have diagonal lines and linear perspective working together here in a way that creates a more interesting image. We also talked about how diagonal lines cause viewers to become active participants in the photo presentation. And this is what you want. You want the viewers to become active participants. That's the whole point of photography. And I remember in the old days when people would bring their neighbors and friends over for slideshows to take a look at the summer vacation slides. So everyone would gather in the living room. The host would set up the slide projector and the slide screen. We'd turn off the lights. We'd watch the slideshow. And if the photographer was particularly skilled, oftentimes that was a very enjoyable and engaging experience. You might even get a few oohs and ahs if there were some spectacular images there. Now, on the other hand, if the photographer was not particularly skilled, those experiences could be a little painful. and you'd have to endure a long stretch of time without much interest or much engagement from the photography itself. Now, we don't use slide photography today, and no one puts on a slideshow, but you do have friends in the digital world, and they're looking at your images, and you don't want to be known as the person that always sends boring photos through the digital medium. So hopefully you can learn from some of these tips and engage the viewers more effectively in the future. Now, here's an example of filling the frame and engaging the viewer with all of those diagonal lines and triangles and geometric shapes. It really makes the eye want to dance across that frame and follow all of those lines. We also use the example of the Winchester house, and how the Winchester house has this series of diagonal lines. It seems everywhere you look, and even the shadow seems to cooperate from that roofline shadow on the right-hand side of the frame. That's it for the recap. Let's move on now to a new scientific principle known as spherical aberration in lenses. And spherical aberration occurs in lenses because lenses are spherically shaped. Now, what happens with spherical aberration is that light rays do not converge at one focal point. There's something wrong with the lens. It has a flaw in the design, or perhaps it's not calibrated properly, or it's not sitting into the lens housing the way it should, so that as a result, those rays are not converging the way they should into one single point. And this results in a softer image, or an image that's less focused than it should be. And here's an example of why that occurs. So you have the light rays coming in from the left side of the screen. They go through that turquoise colored lens, which is spherically shaped. And when the light bends or refracts, it comes through, and there are actually, instead of one point of focus, there are two. The first point of focus, just to the right of the lens, is where most of those lines should cross, but they're not. They're not converging, all of them there. Some of them are converging farther to the right in that second red circle. So you have multiple points of focus, which is not good. I'm going to show you some examples of something that approximates spherical aberration. Now, here's an image of a shot that you can see it's a little fuzzy around the edges. I think, full disclosure here, in this case, I think I just had a dirty lens. And sometimes a dirty lens can also affect how the light diffracts through the lens, but some of the effects are similar. And here's another example where it's just kind of soft and fuzzy around the edges. So that's the kind of thing that can happen with spherical aberration. All right, let's move along. And so let's assume that we have good lenses and we don't have spherical aberration and everything is calibrated properly. How do we fill the frame with interesting imagery? So that's the topic for today. And so we'll spend the rest of the time today talking about how we can use certain techniques and certain tips in composition to give us the best possible results no matter what kind of situation we're encountering. So first of all, what we need to do is to start seeing the frame and how to frame in a different and new way. I know that a lot of people tend to look at the frame as the center of the frame as the most important aspect of photography. Well, that's really not true. So what we need to do is start determining composition by virtue of what happens around the edges of the photograph or the frame, and not what's happening in the center, because the center isn't always the most important part. Now, here's an example of why I'm saying that. If you notice here that the edge of the frame actually defines that photograph. The part in the center that you're looking at is interesting, but it's not as interesting as what's happening around the edges. On the left-hand side, we have that tree, which is close to us, and it's very striking. It also leads our eye into the center of the frame. And on the right-hand side of the frame, you see those that green plant that's sort of hanging over the water, and then there's a tree and a couple of trees behind that. So the edge framing is what really makes this photograph interesting. Here's another example of the mission in Santa Barbara, and the edges are critical in this particular shot. And I actually noticed that on the lower right-hand side of the frame, there's a trash can there, which is a bit of a problem. So I'm going to try to crop that out here. So here I go with cropping the frame to take out that trash can. And we have something like this, which is actually pretty nice. And so you can see in that composition, the center isn't that important. If you look at the center of the frame, you're seeing that small palm tree, which is not the focus of the shot by any means. The taller palm tree on the left is actually much more important. It provides a nice accent to that shot because it's on the edge. And of course, the main part of the cathedral on the right-hand part of the frame is very important. And you even have on the right-hand side of the frame, you have some trees coming in from the upper right-hand side, which also provide a nice little accent. So edge framing is what matters here. So we're going to go to the next graphic and talk about how the center is often unimportant, and what matters most is the peripheral area, which I just showed you in the last couple of slides. So when we're thinking about how we want to conduct our composition, we make center orientation a distance memory and we embrace the edges. That's really the secret to success, I believe. And here's an example of that. So if you notice in this particular photograph, the center is not really very important. In fact, there's not much of interest in the center of the shot. All of the interesting activity is occurring on the right and the left-hand side of the frame. If we look at the right-hand side of the frame, there's a sign that says Southern Wind In, and that's the most important part of the right-hand side of the frame. Over on the left, if you go to the lower left, you see some red flowers which provide a nice splash of color, which really stands out. And then of course the inn itself on the left-hand side of the frame with the two stories. And if you notice, it's rather small, but if you notice behind that tree in the middle, there's a little American flag that's trying to come around the side of that tree, and that's interesting too. So again, the center is not what's important here, it's what's in the edges as we frame this. Here's another example of how the center is not really that important in this shot. It's those totem poles, both of them, one on the left, one on the right, that really provide interest in this particular shot. Okay, now here's another example of using an arching bridge to define the edges of the frame and to create the composition that we want. On the right-hand side, you see the beginning of the frame there with the stairway of the arching bridge, and then it goes over the water, and then the left-hand side of the frame is defined by that bridge on the left side. So just like the diagonal lines that we've talked about that force the eye to follow that line all the way across the frame, with the arching bridge, we're basically climbing over that water with our eyes. And so that's a good way to make the eye travel across the frame. Now in the center, if you look under the bridge, in the distance there's another walkway bridge, and also there's a tree with some pink flowers or some pink leaves that are reflecting in the water, just a little splash of pink, which is also very nice. Okay, let's move along to this shot of the guest house at Hearst Castle. Now if you notice, we have framed the stairwell so that it's not in the center or the stairway. And those stairs actually come across, I think, much more effectively when we put them over in the right-hand side of the frame. Also, that allows us to make sure that that fountain that you see in the center of the shot is not blocking the door and the front of the guest house. And as a result of moving that fountain over to the right-hand side, we can actually see the door to the guest house and also that area above the door of those three little areas that show light above the door. So let's move along and talk about how we can now divide the frame into three parts. And if you think about dividing your frame into a top third, a middle third, and a bottom third, I think that's the best way to go. And we'll take a look at some examples of that. Here's one example. As you see in the top part of the frame, there's a waterfall where water is falling off of the rocks. That pretty well defines the top part of the frame, or the top third. And in the middle of the image, you see that koi fish that's very striking. It's very colorful, and that kind of defines the middle of the frame. And then the bottom, you see that red flower, which defines the frame for the lower third of this image. And then also there's that rock on the left side of the lower third of the frame, which also helps. But you can definitely see we're working with the top third, middle third, and bottom third in this photograph. Now another way to enhance the quality of your photography is to vary the horizon line so it doesn't always exactly cross the middle of the frame. And I know this is a problem with photographers. Sometimes they frame everything with the horizon line across the middle. And that's problematic because oftentimes that doesn't give us any sense of judgment on what it is you're trying to show us in the photograph. We need to know how you feel about what you're photographing. Is the emphasis on what's happening on the land, on the ground where we all live? Most of the time that's the case. So I would say probably 75 or 80% of the photographs, we don't need nearly as much sky as what people are giving us, especially if they're doing that horizon right across the middle of the frame. So if you vary the horizon and give us less sky, the image will be more interesting. And I'm going to show you an example right now. Now this is a yacht race where we see that there is sky, but we don't need to see a lot of the sky because there's not much interesting happening with the sky. There's also a skyline there, so the top third of the frame involves the sky and the skyline, and then the middle part of the frame involves the boats on the water, and that's what's really the most important aspect here. And then in the lower third of the frame, especially on the left-hand side, you see all those people sitting there on the rocks observing what's going on with the boats. So we're using the top third for the sky and the skyline, the middle third for the boats, and then the bottom third to show the people that are observing. Okay, and this is another example of where we don't need to see that much sky. We have the sky and the ocean in the top third, and maybe that golf course. You can see the sand traps there just below where the ocean is. And then the middle part of the frame has that swimming pool area and also that circular walkway there. And then the lower third is dominated by that wrought iron railing that we see in the foreground. Now we can take away the wrought iron railing and then we see the same image, but instead of seeing the wrought iron, we're now noticing the fountain on the lower third part of the frame. And so there are lots of layers here: the sky, the ocean, the golf course, the pool, the walkway, and then the fountain with the grass just above the fountain. So we're working with layers as we're also dividing the composition into thirds. Okay, now here's an example of looking at the ocean where again we don't need to see that much sky in this case. We see the land on the right, the hill, we see the ocean and the crescent beach there, and then on the lower third part of the frame we're seeing a lot of vegetation. So again we have something of interest in every part of that frame, the top, the middle, the bottom. So that's what we're talking about when we say filling the frame. Fill it so that everywhere you look there's something of interest. Now here's the same image, except that we've added a tree just for a little accent note. And in this case, you want to make sure that you don't put the tree right in the middle of the frame. If you put it in the middle of the frame, it's going to divide the frame for no particular reason, and it will be more distracting than it is enhancing. So make sure you put it either in the left-hand third of the frame or the right-hand third of the frame. So I've been talking a lot about the top, middle, and bottom thirds of the composition, but also think in terms of the left third, the middle third, and the right third when you're composing your shots. And again, we need to get away from center orientation, which is why we don't put the tree in the center of the shot. We put it off to the side. Okay, now here's the ocean. I've been talking about how you don't want to give us too much sky because there's an overemphasis on the sky and it really doesn't lend to an interpretation of what you're trying to show us. Now this is a study of blue here, or I would say actually a rhapsody in blue, with my apologies to George Gershwin, the composer. But basically we have blue in the sky, and then we have a cloud layer, and then we have more of a cobalt blue from the ocean, and then we have sort of a gray blue with the wet sand, and then we end up with the dry sand on the beach. But because there's so much blue here, I think it's okay to include the sky. And another thing that this does for us is it shows us the immensity of the ocean and the sky together. By emphasizing a lot of sky, we're also emphasizing the fact that the Pacific Ocean is also stretching out forever beyond the horizon. So you're enhancing both the sky and the ocean by overemphasizing the sky in this case. Now, you would want to use this technique also if you're in a place like Montana, which is known as the Big Sky Country. So to emphasize the Big Sky Country, you need to show a lot of sky. So in those cases, when you're in Montana, and that's the emphasis, you want to make sure that the sky is the dominant aspect of the frame. Okay, now I'm going to move to another concept which I refer to as the all-important rule of threes. Now, there's a phrase that we've all heard that goes something like this: the third time is the charm. Well, in photography, I like to say that three objects supply the charm. And so we're looking for three objects that are of interest in the frame. And when we find those three objects of interest, there's a kind of subconscious symmetry that occurs. In other words, we're not really thinking about it, but it's there. And the subconscious symmetry is that those three objects provide just the right touch or the right balance for that image. And here's the first example. So here we see there's a coat of arms in the middle. There are three objects jutting up into the sky in this particular photo. The one in the middle is the coat of arms. The one on the left is the left-hand side of the castle, and the one on the right is the right-hand side of the castle wall. So we've got three objects that are all jutting into the sky, and it provides the perfect symmetry. Now, here's an example of three objects on the left-hand side of the frame. You see there are the three rams that are sitting on those cement blocks over there on the left. Those three add just the right touch of subconscious symmetry. You see the shadow of the palm tree on the wall behind them. Now, if you framed it so that there were four rams, it probably wouldn't look as good. It wouldn't have that same kind of balance that we see with three. Now, here we see three palm trees in front of the cannon shooting out over the water. And so we want to see those three because that's the rule of threes. Now, speaking of cannons, we actually see three cannons on those wooden carts there. So we have three cannons in a row on those carts. So there's the rule of threes there too. And this even applies to artwork when we're capturing artwork. Now, this is an example of Maori native people art in New Zealand. So we see those three objects, one on the top left, and then there's a diagonal progression from the top left down to the mask on the lower right. So those three objects in the foreground provide that rule of threes, and there's a nice symmetry to that. Okay, now we see three koi fish in the pond, one on the left, one in the middle, and one on the right. So we see those three, and there's just a nice symmetry to that. Now here we see one of the fish has decided to hide, but we still have 3 points of symmetry in this shot, or the subconscious symmetry that I'm talking about. There's the fish on the left, there's the fish on the top middle part of the frame, and then there's that red flower on the bottom right. So there's like a semicircle arch there that we're seeing, or an arc. So just like with that arching bridge that we saw a few minutes ago, now we're seeing that arc of colorful objects in the frame that cause the eye to move across that frame. Okay, now don't forget the foreground and the background relationship when we're filling the frame, because this is really important, because the foreground and the background, they go together. So you need to be complementary so that there's the right balance between what's interesting in the foreground and the background. So always keep that in mind. Here's an example. Again, Hearst Castle. So we see in the foreground we have lots of flowers and lots of foliage there in the foreground. We see the castle in the middle of the frame. But we don't want to just leave that castle with nothing in the sky, so we have some interesting palm trees on the left to fill in that what otherwise would be dead space, and also on the right in that area that might otherwise be considered dead space. So we're filling that frame. Okay, here's another example where we're filling the frame. So we have the roses on the right-hand side and the lower right-hand side. Then we have that zigzagging hedgerow in the left side of the screen, which leads us up into another row of taller roses, and then we have buildings in the background and trees on the left. So we're really filling that frame. Now, let's go to the next one. Here's an example of the garden where you see the foreground. We have some colorful plants. We also have a couple of rocks there to help set up the frame. In the middle, we see the pond, and then above that, we see the wooden walkway and more foliage. So we're providing a filling of the frame with foreground, middle, and background. Here we see an image with several layers. We see the sky, we see the sun going down, we see a layer of hills, we see the water, then we see what is a transitional layer with those trees that look like they're going into silhouette. Then we have the green and the grassy foreground, and what I really like is that little accent on the right-hand part of the frame where that tree stump is cut off. It just adds a nice little touch. You don't want that in the center of the frame. it's a better accent over on the right-hand third. Now here we see a combine in the field. We see a grain elevator on the back part of the frame on the left. We see the cane field on the right, and I'm going to do a little cropping in the field, both literally and figuratively here, because we're talking about crops in the field, so I can do that kind of thing and crop it out and make the combine much more prominent if I like. Okay, so let's go to the next shot. The next image is the same perspective except from a different angle, so we're going to crop that a little bit, and then we can show the machine on the left and the cane on the right and the swathing in the foreground. So we'll go to the next image. Here's some foreground-background combinations that are interesting. The red flowers and the pagoda in the front, and then the tea house in the background. Okay, here we see flowers. We see the red flowers and yellow flowers in the foreground, and we've isolated one flower against that green building in the background. And that green building has diagonal-shaped roofs, so we have a nice image there and a nice touch. So we can actually fill the frame with flower power, and that's the good news with photographing flowers. They're always colorful, and you can fill the frame with them without too much difficulty. Here's an example. Here's a beautiful orchid. This is actually in my backyard, and so I just love the way the yellow, the gold, and the red really stand out in this particular image. Now here we see another example of filling the frame with flowers. That pink flower is beautiful, and then that moist leaf on the left also sets it off nicely. And here's our final image of the day. This is a very colorful flower, and we've certainly managed to fill the frame with that image as well. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed today's show, and I hope you've learned some new techniques and tips that will help your composition, and you can utilize this to enhance your work going forward. Join us again next week when we'll talk about taking shots of people when they're being active. So next time, photographing people. Stay with us for that one. We'll see you again. I'm Dave Kelly. I'll catch you next time.